more about Dr. Dowell before I turn it over to her for her comments today. Dr. Dowell is an associate professor of contemporary Native American art and film here at Florida State University. She is a settler scholar deeply committed to a decolonial research and teaching practice that centers and amplifies the work of Indigenous filmmakers and artists with whom she's collaborated with for close to 20 years. She specializes in art of Native North America with an emphasis on Indigenous cinema and contemporary art. Her research investigates the active processes through which Indigenous filmmakers and artists visualize Indigenous stories, cultural knowledge, and aesthetic traditions. She focuses on their use of experimental forms of art and media in their efforts to express and enact visual sovereignty through their on-screen aesthetics and off-screen production practices. Professor Dowell directs the Visual Culture Media Lab, which is an interactive technology space providing undergraduate and graduate students opportunities to learn media production skills through the creation of their own digital projects documenting cultural heritage. For the last few years, Professor Dowell has been a collaborative partner on the Mikasuki Oral History Project, which engages community leadership in Mikasuki, Florida, a designated Florida heritage site in the collection of their oral histories. This project documents local traditions, including Emancipation Day, African American rural lifeways, agricultural practices, and the significant role of churches in the history of segregation and civil rights activism in this area. We're again definitely excited to have Dr. Dowell with us this afternoon. And so I'll turn it over to you. Welcome and thank you for being with us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and to have this opportunity to share my work with you, but also to be in dialogue with you about these issues around decolonizing and indigenizing perspectives with regard to research and teaching and the work that we're doing as scholars. So I wanted to start a little bit. I'm going to share some images and talk a bit about my work, and then I also want to end with more of a focus on the Mikasuki project, which is a more local collaborative project for me. So before I share those images, though, I guess I would just say that as Dr. Bertrand Jones mentioned, I am a settler scholar. It's important to position oneself with regard to this work. So I'm somebody who's non-native, but I've done collaborative work with Indigenous communities for close to 20 years now, largely in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation, the Musqueam Nation, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. So I've been really honored to be a humble and respectful guest upon their territory doing this work for all of this time. And really, I guess, when I think about my work, I titled this talk "In a Good Way." And so I want to think about the ways that ethical approaches to doing this type of work, especially when there's this long history of extractive scholarship or scholarship, of outsiders kind of jetting into Indigenous communities, taking knowledge away without giving anything back. And so for me, some of the core principles that really guide my approach to doing research are humility, collaboration, gratitude, respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. So what responsibilities do I carry as a settler scholar, as somebody who's not from these communities, but who's been, had the honor enough for people to kind of let me into their lives and to share their experiences and their knowledge with me? Then how do I carry that responsibility with me in the work that I do? In terms of writing, in terms of publication, in terms of teaching about the things that I've gained access to. And this idea of humility is also that as somebody who is a settler scholar, there's always more for me to learn. And this is for me a really core tenet of decolonizing, that it's always an active, ongoing process. There's never, when you hit this, kind of endpoint where everything, it's a commitment to doing that work and to continuing to learn through that process. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, share some images. And also, I really hope that this will be interactive too, so that, as you have questions, that you feel free to shout them out, or if there's something that you want to learn a bit more about. So I did, again, I started doing work in Vancouver really in the early 2000s. And partly why I was working in Vancouver, it was a very interesting place where there was this intersection between art, activism, and media. And this idea of visual sovereignty is really a core component of my research practice and of wanting to understand how Indigenous filmmakers express and enact sovereignty and self-determination through the process of telling their own stories on screen, which is a really radical act when faced with this long history of mainstream media's misrepresentation or glaring absence from the mediascape. So I was really interested in kind of the on-screen processes, what types of kind of work are these films doing, but also more importantly, behind the scenes, how is the process of media production transforming social and cultural relationships and identity, and building community through the process of filmmaking, which is a collaborative social process, right? Because with filmmaking, you need a crew of people, you're working with communities. And really something that's become a very core component of my research practice has been film curation. So public facing engagement through film curation, through community-driven oral history projects, museum work. This has been a really important part of the work that I do. And largely it comes out of this sense of responsibility that I've been entrusted with the knowledge of these films and the stories of these filmmakers. And they want, people to know more about their communities, about what's happening there, about the work that they're doing. So it's about trying to leverage the resources and the space that I have access to bring more visibility to the work that the filmmakers are doing. So I've been involved with a number of film festivals, including when I was at the University of Oklahoma, where I was a professor for 7 years. I was one of the founders of and a primary film curator of this film festival called Native Crossroads, which is still an ongoing festival all these years later, and is now a large collaborative effort, particularly with the Chickasaw Nation. So I think of this image that I'm like moderating a panel discussion with 3 Indigenous women filmmakers and scholars. And I think of this as like my happy place. I really love, there's really for me nothing more powerful than seeing an audience full of Native American and Indigenous people seeing themselves and their stories reflected back on them. It's a really transformative and powerful thing for people to feel that their stories, their voices, their experiences are being represented on screen. So I've tried to incorporate this film curation or facilitating film events and dialogue and discussion around film in all of the places where I've been a professor. And I can talk more also about, I also feel very strongly about the role of university libraries in one of the things that they can do to decolonize and indigenize the library is to purchase educational copies of Indigenous films, because then professors and students can have an opportunity to learn directly from Indigenous people talking about their histories, their stories, their experiences. So that's something that I've always tried to do at every institution that I've worked at. I do think it's important to mention that I had a lot of mentors along the way. I wouldn't be where I am without having had several key important people. And I should mention too, I was a first generation college student when I went to college all those years ago, and then was the first person in my family to attend graduate school. So I actually never really imagined that I would end up as a professor, but because of these relationships that I had and mentors that really encouraged me along the way, this was a really key important thing for me. So Elizabeth Weatherford, who was the director of the Film and Video Center at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian for many decades, was actually the person who first I worked as an intern and then later as a contract employee with her office, and was first introduced to the world of Indigenous film through that. Janet Berlow, who's a very preeminent, now recently retired scholar of Native American art history, is actually the person who encouraged me to apply to graduate school. And then in graduate school, Faye Ginsburg and Karen Blue were two professors who really provided a lot of guidance and encouragement along the way, and also modeled for me what a decolonial collaborative research project looks like, because both of them employed those practices in their own research work. Faye Ginsburg working primarily with Indigenous filmmakers in Australia, and Karen Blue working collaboratively with the Lumbee community in North Carolina for many decades. And then later at the University of Oklahoma, my colleague, Dr. Dan Swan, was very influential mentor for me there as an early career scholar. And again, kind of modeled for me what a responsive, reciprocal, collaborative relationship looks like between a settler scholar and an Indigenous community. He has worked with the Osage Nation for many decades now. Yeah, so again, film's always been kind of where my heart is, and both in terms of facilitating film screening opportunities, but I also teach students about film curatorial theory and practice and encourage them to curate their own film events. But I also teach media production classes as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So these are a few images from the field, and I want to mention a couple of people in particular, because for me, my doing work in a good way means that it's taking care of these relationships. So really my work comes out of relationships that I've built with people, that sense of relationality, that sense of responsibility, that sense of reciprocity, comes out of very long-term relationships. I never wanted to be one of these scholars that kind of jets in just for a few months, leaves, and then doesn't carry on this sense of obligation and collaboration. And that sense of collaboration extends even into the writing process. So when I wrote this book, Sovereign Screens, which was based on my dissertation, everyone who was quoted in it was able to read the quotes. We, together kind of constructed and wrote kind of vignettes about stories of my time in the field. They were able to, I included extended biographies, which is pretty unusual for an ethnography. There was an appendix at the end where the filmmakers could write their own biography and reference other works that I wasn't able to include. There was a filmography, there was a section with information about how people reading the book could access the films. Because of course there's things you have to leave out, when you're writing a book, but I wanted it to be something that was of use and did justice to the incredible community-based activist work of, reclaiming the screen that was happening with the Indigenous media groups that I was part of. So here we're seeing Helen Hague Brown, who's a Chilcotin filmmaker. This is on set of her film, The Legacy, and she's filming her Etsu, or her grandmother who's no longer living, and her mother, Maria Myers, both of whom were Chilcotin language speakers. This is Odessa Shakuya, member of the Kalani First Nation, at the book launch. So I launched the book actually in the community, gifted people, obviously, copies of the book. Cleo Reese, who's Cree and Métis, a member of the Fort McMurray First Nation in Northern Alberta, is a longtime mentor for me, and somebody who was very involved with the Red Power movement in the 1960s and 70s in Vancouver, and then carried that community activism work into the work that she did with the Indigenous Media Arts Group. Was a co-founder of the Image Nation Aboriginal Film and Media Festival, which was the first Indigenous film festival ever to be held in the province of British Columbia. And it ran for almost a decade. And then this is Vera Wabagishig over here, who's an Anishinaabe Kwe filmmaker, community activist, and her daughter, Storm Standing on the Road, who is now So this will tell how long these photos, how old these photos are. Her daughter is now in her early 20s. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of mention that to talk about this sense of King's ethics and responsibilities to community, and the relationships are really, that's where I'm held accountable. So especially as somebody, again, who's from the outside, who's not from these communities, my connections to the people in the community are where I'm held accountable in that research process and in the writing process. I've often think about the work that I do as trying to make space when and wherever I can to provide support for the people who've been so generous enough to kind of welcome me into their world and to share their experiences and their stories with me. I feel a sense of, there's a great weight of responsibility that comes with that. If I'm, writing a book or I'm writing an article about somebody else's life and their stories and their experiences and their work as an artist, then it's important for me to do it in a good way. And this phrase, in a good way, comes from a lot of indigenous ideas about protocol, about ceremony, about maintaining good relations. And that extends both between, it's a core tenet in terms of like relationality, in terms of being a good relative, but it also is used in terms of epistemologies about human, non-human, or human and other than human relations as well. So it's also about good stewardship in terms of caretaking over the land, over the waters, over relationships to other animal species. So I think about that in my own practice, right? Like how can I carry out this work in a good way that honors and pays respect to the people who I have built up these connections and these relationships to? And in what ways can my work bring more voice and visibility for the people that I'm working with? So one of the other things that's really important to me is that the best way to decolonize the screen is to get the tools of the media production into the hands of people who haven't had access to it, or who have been historically underrepresented or misrepresented in the past, so that people can make their own media. And so teaching video workshops has been something that has been really important to me. So when I was in Oklahoma, I helped to facilitate a number of youth video workshops with several different Native American nations located in and around the University of Oklahoma, and taught the basics of pre-production, production, and the post-production process. And then we would hold a big film event at the end. And again, very excited to see the stories that people tell when they have access to the technology and the means of production. Already talked a little bit about the Native Crossroads Festival. And so this emphasis on media production also is part of my teaching. So I did for many years video production here, and oftentimes also teaching students about this kind of collaborative work, especially if they were making a documentary about a community which they are not a member of. And so that kind of, I guess, leads into the oral history project in Mikasuki. So this is the oral history project in Mikasuki. Kind of there's a long backstory to this, but I'll give you the abbreviated version, of which is that I got connected to this project through a woman named Amanda Griffiths, who used to be she was actually a former student of mine. So she took a video production class with me like 12 years ago. She later went on to get a master's degree in folklore and then became the state folklorist of Florida. So we both kind of ended up back here in Tallahassee, even though I met her as a student in Kentucky. As the state folklorist of Florida, her job was to help to facilitate the Florida Folklife program and to do a lot of oral history projects and facilitate apprenticeship programs. the city of Tallahassee and the Leon County Planning Department were doing a placemaking survey with Mikasuki, and the Mikasuki Citizens Working Group, many of the members of which you see here, were interested and identified an oral history project as something that they wanted to do in their community, that there was a need for this, particularly because many residents are starting to get elderly and they want to document those stories. So the city and the county actually reached out to Amanda, who reached out to me. And so the two of us got involved with it. Amanda has since moved on to another job in Georgia. But as part of this project, we started going to the citizen working group meetings, which were once a month, getting to know folks there. And then we were really like the facilitators, I guess you would say, of the project. So this is actually the very first oral history we recorded, and we did a training. I mean, we wanted to train the folks in the community so that they could do the oral histories themselves. But what we came to find out was that many of the people in the working group actually they wanted us to run the equipment, that the technology was a bit intimidating or a bit daunting for them. So we just became like the technical facilitators. We would show up with the equipment, set the equipment up, and record the sessions. But Mr. Leonard Forbes, who you see here, he got very interested in the oral history project, and he really is the one leading the project. So he created all the questions. He's a lifelong resident of Mikasuki. He knows a lot of folks there. And so he identified who he would like to interview, came up with the questions. And then we did hold this one community recording day where, you know, anyone could come by if they wanted to record their story. And we hope to do another community recording day. But in the end, we've recorded at this point about 10 interviews. We have about 10 hours of footage that's logged. And actually, maybe I'll stop sharing this for a second. And can I share? I have the link if you're interested in the website where we have the oral history project. Sorry, let me just get out of there. So we have the oral histories that we have recorded at this point. What we did was we hired somebody to edit them into short profile videos that could be shared via their social media platforms. They do have a Facebook page, so they've shared these videos that way. But all of the videos have been archived at the State Archives of Florida, and we hired somebody to transcribe them as well. So the Citizens Working Group, they also have all the transcripts. And they were really excited about the idea of it being archived with the state archives, because it would make it available to their children, their grandchildren, and to the public in the future. And one of the concerns in the community is that there's an incredibly dynamic, rich history to this area, but not very much known about it, particularly here in Tallahassee. So they were really, you know, kind of energized by the idea of this oral history project. Their larger goal in the community actually has to do with a community center, and there's a long debate and struggle between the citizens of Mikasuki and the city and the county with regard to what shape and form that community center will take. But they see the oral history project as a way to demonstrate the value of their stories, of their presence, of their experience in Mikasuki. And eventually, if and when that community center gets renovated or built, they would like to create a space in the center where we could have like TV monitors and these oral histories could be playing. There could be an exhibit or some kind of museum display. There's also like a lot of archival documentation and family photos and photos of the area that people would like to see kind of included the work that they're doing in Mikasuki. So Yeah, so I mean, this project is for me like very near and dear to my heart because I really have gotten to know and enjoy the opportunity with folks out there, um, and the pandemic. I mean, COVID has kind of put things a bit on hold there with regard to the oral history project, but we did have plans. I did have plans over the summer. This past summer, we were intending to run. Dr. Mary Young, who's part of the Citizens Working Group, has a nonprofit group called the Mikasuki Youth Education Foundation. And so we were, and there's a chapter of the Boys and Girls Club of the Big Bend that's out there in Mikasuki. So we were going to run a youth training, media training workshop for folks there in Mikasuki over the summer, but it's not safe to do that right now. And, you know, with regard to social distancing and things like that. So that's kind of on hold, but we have all of the equipment. I have all of the equipment in the media lab. So it's just a matter of, you know, when the pandemic situation improves, that we'll be able to do that. And that's a really, I would say that's a really important component to the work that I'm doing in Mikasuki, because to make this kind of practice sustainable, the knowledge, skills, and equipment need to be located in the community, right? They need to not have to rely on myself or somebody else, you know, to come in with the equipment. And so that's something that helps to make these projects sustainable in the long run. And that was part of the work, you know, I kind of learned that very early on in the collaborative work that I was doing in Vancouver, because the group I was working with, the Indigenous Media Arts Group, incorporated training as part of, so it wasn't just that they were facilitating a film festival, but they also had both like beginner media training programs as well as advanced, so professional development as well. They also had like a media checkout system. So they had equipment that people from the community could just come and check out and take for their own projects. There was a small fee associated with it, but people who couldn't afford the fee, they also were able to volunteer, you know, a few hours at the organization in order to gain access to it. So that was a really important kind of lesson for me early on about strategizing, about how to make these programs more kind of long lasting. Yes, I guess I'll just end on, because I'm not sure what time, I don't want to leave time for questions. But I wanted to end with a few words on like what, to me, you know, what does decolonizing mean, or indigenizing to, these are two different approaches to the topic. And I would say that, you know, for me, I think of it as decolonizing the work that I'm doing, but also indigenizing, because I do try to bring these teachings, these frameworks of the core values that I've learned from my collaborators into not just the work that I do in terms of research, but also in terms of teaching, especially about reciprocity. And, I often, think about and encourage students to think about whose voices are being privileged, who has access to space, where is this research serving the you're with. That's, you follow this core ethical path, right? But if it's only self-serving, only something that's about promoting for it, if you're making decisions, which is to say there's a lot of things I've done in my career that did not necessarily with what gets a value path, to tenure and promotion. For me, so what does decolonizing mean to me? And when I summarize it for students, for me, it means, and that, I guess, I kind of think about that it's not oftentimes the people about it, because they're just kind of behind the scenes doing the work. And one kind of small example of that, I helped out when I was at the University of Oklahoma they have a student organization there called the American Indian Student Fellowship, and every Monday, Native American faculty and staff serve dinner to students. Anyone can show up. And I, for 7 years, just followed at this dinner. In person who showed up, and I just kept showing up. And it took, a while for people to trust me and to get to know, but that actually became a really point of connection and community for me there at Oklahoma that led to, 2 of the people in Alana Weton are members of the Kiowa Nation and the longtime facilitators of that fellowship dinner. There became collaborators, colleagues, and very dear to me. So, doing the work and showing, for me, it's active and ongoing. It's a lifelong process, a lifelong commitment to always learn more and to do the work. It's not an established state, but a constant work in progress. The goal is to make space, take space. So for me, how can I'm always thinking about, I don't come from a wealthy background, but, I think about where do I have points of access to resources in the institutions where I'm working, and where can I leverage connection to those resources in ways that will support and facilitate the film work and the stories of the filmmakers. And I think it's always important to, question who has access to institutions like academia and museums, doesn't, or can we question and dismantle those points of exclusion? Where can we build points of connection and fight for inclusivity within these spaces? And, I think it's part of the I do in terms of research is also deeply connected to the work I do, which has helped me to develop an approach that is more culturally responsive and that helps to facilitate support for students from a variety of backgrounds in the classroom. I want them to feel that their stories and their experiences are valued, are reflected in the content that they see in the class. So I don't know, it's a real privilege, it's an honor. I mean, I'm also like all the time telling students, I feel very lucky is professor. It's really a joy to be able to have opportunities to continue to do this work, and also to be able to help share that work with students and with colleagues. So, and I'm thankful I had this chance to share with you, answer questions or
given. I wrote down so many notes about the ways that your work and I think some of the grounding principles, values extend or can extend into our work in educational research. Am I frozen? Nope. Okay, I saw a couple of you move. Okay. And so one of the questions that I had for you, Kristin, is there are for folks that are doing research in schools or in communities around education, there is a reciprocity and relationality, as you described it, is definitely important. How do we, in your work, have you had to convince colleagues who don't necessarily view those things, those values as important? How do you encourage this sort of thinking about going into communities and just taking information or gathering our data and leaving, and not not leaving the communities better than when we entered them?
Yeah, so this is such a great question. And partly I kind of just felt like it is hard. It is hard oftentimes to convince colleagues or institutions that this approach to work is the way to go, or that it's of value, especially when, you know, in my case, publishing a book, that was 10 years, almost 11 years actually, from the time I started that fieldwork until when that book actually came out as an object in hand was 11 years. And, you know, a lot happened in between, but that kind of long-term commitment and the investment in that in relationships can be sometimes, if there's all these metrics around productivity, you know, productivity in terms of articles published, grants gotten, you know, there's this sense of urgency and speed, which with one happens, you know, that you need to work. And I really reject that. You know, I don't think that that's healthy, that kind of pressure around publishing and getting things out just for the sake of getting them out is something that has, I just think it's not a healthy way. And I'd encourage you all, if you don't follow the NAP Bishop Tricia Hersey and the NAP Ministry on Instagram, definitely I would encourage everyone to follow her and her guidance about.
I love the NAP Ministry. Yeah. I'll put it in the chat.
So partly I would say, I think, you know, I'm a bit of an interloper and an outsider in the academy too. And I kind of just knew that I was going to do things the way that I wanted to do them and the way that felt right to me. For instance, you know, I did have a colleague early on who was pressuring me to get this book out very early because I was on the tenure track. And, you know, they were like, well, it doesn't matter, just get it out there. And I'm like, no, it has my name on it. And more importantly, it has the people I'm working with, it has their names and their stories in it. And I want them to have the time to sit with it and give me feedback and to have this back and forth. So I was, you know, more down to the wire maybe than some of my mentors would have liked with regard to the publication timeline. I think things are changing though. You know, I think there is a lot of emphasis on public facing scholarship. People want to see, you know, how is research relevant and applicable to, you know, especially for universities to build relationships with communities in the area where they are, right? That this kind of public facing work can be a way to foster and facilitate good relationships between universities and their neighbors. I would say to seek out, there are specific funding opportunities, you know, grants that do support this type of work. The Whiting Foundation, for instance, has a public engagement fellowship for faculty. The, you know, the NEH Digital Humanities grants, a number of these grants that that do recognize the importance of collaboration. And, you know, even in terms of thinking about ways that you can build in collaborator fees. So even if, you know, if you're doing an interview and you're able to pay somebody to compensate them for their time, that's a small way to be reciprocal in that process. Or thinking about if there's a need in that school where you're doing research, you know, are you able to help provide supplies or access to books or, you know, equipment? Sometimes those are things you can build into the grant that you're able to leave there in the community. Yeah, so those are just a few things that kind of come to mind, I guess.
If you all have questions for Dr. Dowell, please raise your hand or unmute yourself. I have many others, but I don't want to just take all the time to answer my questions.
Hi, Dr. Dowell. Jonathan Jackson.
Hi.
I'm a doc student in the higher ed program, and I also specialized faculty in the College of Business. You were talking, you mentioned towards the end about ways to sort of decolonize the classroom and also to help maybe marginalized voices feel a little more comfortable in those spaces. But unfortunately on my end, your audio stream was getting really choppy right
Okay.
at that point. So
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about ways that you have done that in your own classrooms.
Okay, yeah, sure. I have a couple of specific things. One, is to think about, to be mindful about who, which scholarship you're using in the class, which scholars you're citing. So in my case, if I'm teaching on Indigenous film or contemporary Native art, I'm being mindful about including Indigenous scholars wherever possible. And I do think for me, one of the biggest drives for me is that Indigenous and Native American experiences are so vastly underrepresented in universities, and in the K through 12 system, also very underrepresented. So many, it's something like 83% of K through 12 schools in the US don't have any requirement with regard to their curriculum, including Native history, past the year 1900. So if they're including anything at all, it's something that's historical, and it's oftentimes maybe a week here, and then, maybe in the 4th grade, you might get a week on Native history, right? But nothing about contemporary experience, understandings of tribal sovereignty, any of that. So it's like right at the outset, when you get folks coming into a college classroom, I'm already encountering that lack of awareness, lack of knowledge, that invisibility. So for me, again, any time I can kind of bring in Indigenous content, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a course that's dedicated specifically on Indigenous topics, that's a point of intervention into those erasures in the wider K through 12 system. So again, you can do that through films, through multimedia, through websites. Like there's so many great guys are, I don't know if you're familiar with the Illuminatives website, illuminatives.org. They created curriculum around Native education especially for educators in this pandemic moment and parents trying to teach from home. So free lesson plans and curriculum. This is one of their big missions in getting rid of mascots, this education push for them. So again, like in terms of content, like what am I teaching? Whose voices am I centering? What kind of scholarship am I centering in those decisions about making syllabi? But also, I try to I don't want to reinforce authority in the classroom. Like I don't position myself as an expert. I just am somebody who I have done this work for a long time, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert on it. There's always more for me to learn too. And so I construct the classroom as we're co-creating this environment together. And so things like when we meet in, not pandemic times, we sit in a circle and we do check-ins. We kind of see where students are. I'm a big proponent of I've also used the Black Space Manifesto, which has a series of learning principles that are also very in line with Indigenous philosophies. So bringing in voices from the margins, centering lived experience, reckoning with the past to build a future, creating circles, not lines. So that's been, I use that kind of as what I tell the students, okay, these are the principles of engagement. We kind of agree to that, or we discuss it in the beginning of class. And it's a great tool to return back to. So helping to facilitate respectful dialogue in the class too. That's something that that I have found useful. I've also incorporated, the land acknowledgements is something that has been, I have it on my syllabus. I read it. It's like part of the practice that we do. And land acknowledgements are just, they're one step, but the land acknowledgements are rooted in Indigenous protocols of expressing gratitude and humility. And so I also tell the students all the time, I'm like, so thankful that they're here. I'm glad they're here. I also ask them, like, is there anything else that I can do to better facilitate your learning? Like what, are there points of clarification that you need or additional resources. You know, we also decide what kind of assignments or assessments we want to use in the classroom. And I'm very flexible with that too. We may, you know, it's like life changes on the ground, so you got to roll with it. So those are a few ways that I am trying to build a teaching practice in a classroom space that doesn't reproduce hierarchy and inequality, and where people feel that they're in a welcome space and their experiences are valued there.
Thank you.
These
Sure.
are great resources, and I've been dropping them in the chat, y'all. So feel free to
Oh, great.
add some bookmarks to these. You'll see them later. We'll provide some resources for you later, but these are really good. Thank you, Kristin.
Yeah.
Other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand. Hey, Jay, you got a question? Come on.
Yeah, there are so many questions that are right there that I just can't really pinpoint right now. But I was going to ask if you had anything link-wise that I could specifically use for Mikasuki, only because I'm a graduate student in the educational leadership program, but I'm an English teacher. And so when we do Their Eyes Were Watching God, I've used that as a time when I can talk about, because of course they don't really like say, but I'm saying, well, if they're down there in this area, the Mikasuki live there. And so I kind of like use that as an opportunity to talk about it. But it'd be great if we could do some kind of like virtual field trip or something where I can know that the information I'm giving them is not just this glossed over what I know about it, which is not very much, kind of.
Yeah. So I'll put in the chat. So in terms of South Florida, so the Mikasuki Tribe of Florida has a great tribal website, and then the Seminole Tribe of Florida does as well. And their newspaper is a really excellent, the Seminole Tribune is a really excellent resource to teach with, because it's a great way to keep up with like, what are the current events, but you also get it's informative. The Seminole Tribe of Florida actually has 7 reservations. So the tribal government is administering the most number of different reservations, and they're spread, you know, from Tampa to South Florida, right? So the newspaper is a way to keep each other informed about what's happening in the different communities. And that's available online. And then also the Ataseki Museum is the tribal museum for the Seminole Tribe of Florida. So they do have virtual tours, I think, through their space and through they have like a living, not a living history, but they have a space where they do like cultural demonstrations, and they have interpreters that work there. So those are some great resources. In terms of the Mikasuki, so Mikasuki, Florida, it has this very interesting history, right? Because in the name, it's referencing, you know, the Mikasuki. Obviously, they did live in that territory as well. It was also at one point home to one of the largest Muskogee Creek village sites, until Andrew Jackson came across in the early 1800s, and there was a massacre there, actually. But there are very deep roots there in terms of the indigenous history and interesting intersections between Black history and Native history in Mikasuki. But I can also share the link if you want to use any of the oral histories, with the edited profiles that we have. And the transcripts and the full-length videos are also available, I think, through the state archives as well. They should be available, but if not, I can make them available to folks that want to use them. But yeah, in general, I would say if you're seeking out information about, you want to provide resources for students about Native nations, like, you know, their official tribal website. And then if there's a tribal museum, that those are in newspaper. Some places have their own television station or, you know, radio stations as well. The Cherokee Nation and Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma, they both have web platforms that have television shows that are produced for anyone to watch. So those are good resources.
Can I jump in and ask
Sure.
a question? I'll try to, I'll wake up. Not wake up, I just shed my messy room. But I actually have a question about your research in terms of kind of how you come to it. And I think if we think about different ways of sharing and capturing culture and history, we have sound, right, through our folk music archives and things like that. But yours is like visual history. So kind of what attracts you to the visual history? And I think in terms of kind of Native communities, is there some kind of deeper connection on the visual aspect of your research and your work with them?
Yeah, so for me, one of the most, so I got interested in this topic actually as an intern. So I was interning in graduate school at the Film and Video Center at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, which at the time had one of the largest collections of film and video produced by Indigenous filmmakers in the Western Hemisphere. And my job was actually to watch films and works from their collection to assess if there were any issues of damage, if there would need to be any conservation work done, and to update information in the database. So that internship experience, which on the surface might seem like, wow, this is really, boring. I'm entering information into a database. It was incredibly rich for me to be able to see visually how the films were structured, aesthetically very different than what we think of with like mainstream film or conventions of Hollywood filmmaking. So I am very interested in a lot of the work that I write about is experimental. So it's experimental film. It might be seen as much in a film festival as in an art gallery or video installation context. I've written a lot also more recently about Amanda Strong. She's a Michif filmmaker who does stop motion animation. So she hand builds all of the puppets and the sets and the props, and then it's animated through photography and digital software, special effects. So I'm interested in that like connection between, she's also a beadwork artist. Her mother, her grandmother were beadwork artists. So thinking about this kind of handwork tradition that she comes from, but how she's adapting it to a digital media form. But yeah, so there are a lot of ways in which indigenous films are quite different from and what we think of as like with forms of narrative film. So or the cinematographer, language is another way. Indigenous language, it's different. And then circulations of time and are in that.
Oh, darn it. Oh, we lost her. Okay. Well, the joys of technology, right? And bring us in and take us out. This has actually been a really good conversation for me in terms of thinking about what does decolonizing mean. And as we move forward, one of the goals of our R3s is that we just plant these seeds. We plant these seeds, these ideas. What does decolonizing mean in general? And then what could that look like for us or for you in your individual work, in our collective work? And I think that we've been able to identify, oh yeah, she's
I don't know what happened there. I'm sorry.
That's okay. The internet,
Yeah.
it's okay. I was just kind of bringing us back to the,
Yeah. I'm sorry about that. My internet connection is not good today, I guess.
That's okay. Some days is good and some days is not.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes.
Hi, Dr. Dowell. I'm doing research with Yucatec Maya healers in Belize. And with the COVID-19, the research has gone in a completely different direction. And I was thinking about talking circles as a data collection method. And it changed completely. The circle consisted of not only ancestors joining us, but the plants joining us, and they now that I am finished with data collection, one of the participants would like to take our interviews and put it out there as a form of educating, the Belizean people. And so I'm working with the National Institute of Culture and History. But what I think is, the question is that, how do you collaborate with another entity, not just the participants, but with others, and making them understand that these participants can represent themselves. These participants can have a voice. So they don't have to come to me as a researcher, but they have to involve the participants also in getting, ideas as and also involving them in the decision making of bringing these interviews and videos together, because they're sharing videos with me. I've been a part of the ceremonies. I've been a part of the medicine gathering videos and so forth. So, this it's a lot happening, but I want them to understand also that these women have power. They decide for themselves what should be made and what should be done with these videos that they have helped to gather.
Yeah, so I would make sure, because you could be involved in the process of, it's like the licensing or the videos over to the institution that you're collaborating with. You could make sure that there's language in there about, these are being archived, will they be open access to everyone? Do they want any restrictions placed around them? Will the films be archived in their original unedited form? Or, you want to especially make sure that you're not giving permission to the institution to edit the films without permission. So I think that would be a important way to help facilitate healers and the institution where their material is going to be out, so that they have a control and autonomy over that as possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
And you might also think about a lot of collaborative Indigenous media places too that would be interested in this work. Forms is asuma.tv, and there's work from all over the world, Indigenous media from all over the world on that platform. It almost functions like a YouTube channel for Indigenous content creators. It's managed and organized and supported by Igloolik Asuma, which is an Inuit video making collective based up in Nunavut. But that might be another interesting, place of connection if they wanted to get connected up with other Indigenous media makers, especially around traditional ecological knowledge and land-based practices like that. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great information. Appreciate it.
Yeah. I'll put that website in the chat.
Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Dowell or points of clarification, information? Kudos, none, grunts, groans. Well, thank you all for being here with us. We thank you, Kristin, for sharing all of the information that you shared with us. Great websites and other resources for us to peruse for ourselves. And I think you've planted lots of seeds. I'm especially
Oh, good.
for the recording so I can go back and write down these core values to talk about in my qualitative research class that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, just the things that undergird your work in general. So I hope that all of you have taken lots of things from this, and we'll continue this conversation as we as part of our R3 series. So we appreciate y'all being here with us and you sharing your insights and being a great resource at Florida State. So thank you.
Yeah, good luck with all of your research, and feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions or if there's anything else I can help with. I'm happy to. I really love learning about other people's engagement with research and how you're approaching your topics. So yeah.
We'll make sure to include you on
Appreciate it.
our mailing list and let you come back and
Oh yeah.
the great work everybody else is doing. Y'all take good care
That sounds great.
today and enjoy the good sunshine, and it's a new day.
Yeah.
New day.
Right.